Hello everyone and welcome to my presentation on the horizontal jump approach. Let's start with some horizontal jump approach basics, some basic governing principles that we'll use when we're assembling approaches for young jumpers. Our first consideration should always be the length of the approach. Now, the length of the approach as measured in feet and inches is not important. What is important is the length of the approach as measured in number of steps, because the number of steps is what's going to dictate the velocities that your jumper experiences at takeoff. In fact, if coaching is consistent and you have jumpers who have comparable ability levels and run the same number of steps, you're going to find that the approach distances are almost identical in most cases. Now, when we're looking at actual numbers of steps for middle schoolers in the long jump, 12 steps is a pretty good number to begin with. In the long jump at the introductory high school level, 14 steps is a good number, and your better high school long jumpers should be jumping from around 16 steps or so. Most collegiate long jumpers use about 18 steps, and most elites use around 20 steps. Now, if you're looking at the triple jump approach lengths, typically you're going to be anywhere from 1 to 3 strides shorter in that situation. Now, the numbers that I gave you were all even numbers, but you can have approaches with odd numbers of steps or even numbers of steps, depending upon how the jumper sets up their start and the takeoff foot that they choose to use. So let's discuss a little bit about the starting foot and the jumping foot and how it relates to odd and even approaches. Um, If we examine human-handedness patterns, we all know that we have one hand that's more coordinated than the other. For most of us, that's the right hand. That means that most of us are right-handed. Well, in our lower bodies, we also have handedness patterns. We always have one leg and one side of the body that is more coordinated, but the other leg is typically stronger. So we have a strong leg and a coordinated leg, and those legs aren't the same leg. We always want to begin our approach with the stronger leg in front. So our starting stance should always show the stronger leg in front, which, by the way, is the same thing you would do if you took this athlete and placed them in starting blocks or in a sprint start. Now, if you're trying to determine which leg is the strongest, the best way to determine this is to have them do a vertical jump off of one leg. Most of the time, athletes will go for height in jumping, not necessarily distance, but for height in jumping off of the stronger leg. So if you're inside, you can have an athlete jump off of one leg and try to touch the basketball rim, and the leg that they naturally go off of is likely to be the stronger leg. If you're outside, you can have them jump up and touch the goalpost off of one leg, and that'll give you the stronger leg. But that stronger leg should be in front. Now, when we look at long jump approaches, the takeoff leg should be determined by comfort. Most jumpers will prefer to jump off of the stronger leg, and that's the preference for most jumpers and most coaches. So if a jumper is starting with their strong leg in the front and they're going to jump from the strong leg, they're going to have an even number of steps in their approach. However, there are a few exceptions. Some jumpers prefer to jump off of the coordinated leg, the other leg. The reason why, and often these are the fastest jumpers, and the reason why is because, keep in mind, our stronger leg is our least coordinated leg. So these faster athletes, sometimes they don't feel like they can pull the trigger in time because that leg isn't coordinated enough, and they'll prefer to jump off of that coordinated leg. Well, if those athletes are going to start with the strong leg in front and jump off of the coordinated leg, then they're going to have an odd number of steps in their approach. So that being said, that's how you would determine whether a person is going to run an even number of steps or odd number of steps. And by far, the even number of stepped approaches in the long jump are more common. Now, in the triple jump, it's a little different. Some coaches prefer to have them use the strong leg twice, but my personal preference is to use the coordinated leg early in the triple jump in that first phase when the things are happening quicker. And then as we decelerate in the event, I want to use my least coordinated leg, but my stronger leg later. So I prefer to have athletes triple jump leaving the board with their coordinated leg. So for that reason, I have lots of athletes who might long jump off of the strong leg and triple jump off of the coordinated leg. And this means that those athletes will often have an even number of steps in the long jump and an odd number of steps in the triple jump. And their triple jump approaches are either 1 or 3 steps shorter than the long jump approaches. So that's just something that I think you need to think about when you're setting your jumper up rather than just guessing or making arbitrary decisions. Put a lot of thought into these handedness patterns and put a lot of thought into the number of steps there. Other than that, there are no differences in the long jump and the triple jump approaches. The mechanics are the same. The only difference, again, is that triple jump approaches, because the triple jump is a little more technically complicated event. Normally, the approaches are a little shorter because of the added coordinative demands. Now, for the sake of teaching and discussion, I break my approaches down into 4 phases: the start, the drive phase, the continuation phase, and the transition phase. And these phases are not distinct. They blend together smoothly, and it should be kind of difficult to determine exactly where one phase ends and the next phase begins. The drive phase consists of the first 6 steps of the approach. The transition phase consists of the final 4 steps of the approach, and the continuation phase consists of all of the steps in the middle. The number of steps, of course, is determined by the total number of steps in the approach. Let's discuss the start first. I spend a tremendous amount of time and effort in regulating and teaching the start, because in most cases, if you put athletes into good starting positions and they hit the start correctly, a lot of the acceleration mechanics that follow fall into place naturally without a whole lot of discussion and teaching. So that being said, investing time in teaching the start is very important, and I spend a lot of time there. I think one of the most common mistakes in coaching the approach is simply not investing in teaching the start and allowing athletes to start any way they feel like without any regulation, and that just typically produces lots of bad habits. In a second, we're going to look at a video, and we're going to look at the different mechanics of the starts that are listed here. And I only allow 2 different types of starts, either a crouch start or a rollover start. And the reason why is because these are 2 very simple starts, and simplicity lends itself to consistency. Accuracy is, of course, important in this approach. So anytime that you're doing starts that have additional components to them or are complicated, like jog-ins or walk-ins, all it does is contribute to inaccuracies. So that being said, crouch starts and rollover starts are the only starts that I allow my athletes to use, and we can look at those in a video in the next slide. Let's look at the crouch start on video. Here you can see the crouch start is a simple 2-point push out. But there are some key coaching points involved in it, and let's discuss those. First of all, the width of the stance. It's important in the start that the hips are high. And if the feet get too wide, by simple geometry, the hips get too low. So that being said, anywhere from 8 to 12 inches spacing between the feet is appropriate, and we definitely don't want to be any wider than that under any circumstances. The next variable that's important to us is the alignment of the shins. If you'll notice here, the shins are tilted forward. I tell athletes to take the front knee and place it over the front toe. The back shin I don't worry about too much, because if you're doing the correct stuff with the front shin, the back shin naturally falls into place. This is important because our bodies are hardwired to apply force through that shin, and the shin ultimately dictates the angle at which forces are going to be applied. So if the shin is tilted correctly, it sets up the correct angle of push off into the start. In that start, we want to push out, but we also want to push up a little bit, and that's exactly the direction in which the shin is aligned as you see it right now. So looking at the shin angle is important, and a lot of your problems with false stepping as athletes begin their runs are related to improper positioning of the shin here. So the shin should be tilted forward. Next thing that we'll take a look at is this folding of the body. If you'll notice, the chest is very close to the front thigh, so we see this angle closed here. This is important. The hips are the biggest, strongest joints in our body, and when the hips unfold, that provides the power that we want at the start. However, we can't unfold if we didn't fold first. So many jumpers fail to fold this way at the start, and as a result, their mechanics and acceleration aren't as good as they should be, and they don't get the momentum at the start that they should as a result of it. Now, all jumpers are typically comfortable bending their knees at the start, but not many of them like to bend at the waist at the start, as you see here. So this folding is very important. If you don't fold, what typically happens is you don't get the power, but more importantly, the knee and ankle fire out of sequence, and the next thing you have is a person with excessive backside because of that improper firing sequence. So folding at the waist is important as we begin the approach run. Next, if you'll notice, obviously the arms are in opposition. Jeremy's left leg is forward, so his right arm is forward. Sometimes we see young jumpers who make mistakes with that, so just make sure the arms are positioned correctly. And finally, the weight distribution. We want a little bit, maybe 5 or 10% of the weight on the back foot, because we want a little bit of pressure and a little bit of force from that back foot when we push out. So all of the weight is not on the front foot. A little bit of the weight is on the back foot. This is also important because if all of the weight is on the front foot, our initial angle of push is typically too flat, and then we get a stumble. Now, it might not be a really bad stumble. It might not be a stumble that your eyes catch, but it's enough of a stumble to prevent the jumper from getting tall later in the approach run. So keeping a tiny bit of weight on the back foot is important. And what I do is I make sure that the hip is over the front heel. If the hip is over the front heel, then you know that you're okay. If the hip gets out beyond the front heel, further in front, then you know there's too much weight on that front leg and your initial angle of push is going to be too flat. Keep in mind that at the start, we don't want an outward push. We want an outward and upward push. That upward component is important as well. So when we push out, again, out and up is the key. And you'll notice here you see a big split. So we're establishing big ranges of motion from the very first step of the run. And you can see a nice, strong, complete push off at the completion of the start. Now this is a rollover start. Here you can see a rocking action into the start before we actually push off. And let's take a look at the rollover start. We have the same foot spacing basically. And notice that as Jeremy rocks back, his left foot's forward, so his right arm is up. Now, as he rocks back completely, notice the position of the ankle here. The ankle is dorsiflex and the heel is down. We want dorsiflexion of the ankle in the run when we sprint, so we dorsiflex the ankle in the start. Many jumpers run poorly because at this point, they'll point the toe. They'll pick up the heel as opposed to picking up the toe. So make sure they pick up the toe and not the heel at this particular point. Now, once I release the video, I want you to watch carefully. You'll see a slight shift of weight forward, but the predominant movement is a bending at the waist. So notice how Jeremy shifts the weight forward very slightly, but bends at the waist to a great degree. Again, because we don't want an extreme weight shift here. So here you can see as he starts to move, once again, you can see a very dominant bending at the waist. And then we see the same shin angles we saw before. We see the same folding of the hips. And if you'll notice when we hit that position, we see the same weight distribution. There's still a tiny amount of weight on the back foot. Arms, of course, are still alternated. And the direction of push is the same, out and up. Here you see the same full, complete extension. And of course, you also see the same big split established at takeoff as well. So if you'll notice, what we're seeing is that the rollover start is just a different way of getting into the same positions. The rollover start, though, does give us the opportunity and the advantage of being able to see the board and see, visually locate things down the runway before we actually begin the approach run. Now let's discuss the drive phase, the first 6 steps of the approach. Our number one focus here is momentum development. We're not trying to develop velocity, we're trying to develop momentum. The reason is that if we develop momentum early in the run, we'll be more efficient and more effective at developing velocity later in the run. And the failure to develop momentum early in the run is the reason why we see lots of problems at takeoff. Athletes get to the board and they feel a lack of momentum, and as a result of that, they make mistakes or compensate for that lack of momentum. So, developing momentum in the drive phase is critical. Now, we do this with the proper mechanics. The drive phase should be characterized by a slow rate of turnover. We don't want a quick step out of the back. We don't want high rates of turnover. We want a very slow, patient type of turnover as we begin our run. We want big displacements, which means that the steps are covering distance and that we see big, strong, forceful types of strides. Not quick steps, but strong pushing types of steps. And then the ranges of motion are big. We should see big splits between the thighs, big swings of the arms, big ranges of motion so that we're applying force through those large ranges of motion. Most good coaches use words like pushing or driving to characterize the drive phase because those are good words to dictate the type of that and indicate the type of mechanics that we should see in this phase of the approach. And the most common mistake by far in the drive phase is being too quick or being too fast so that we're not applying force and not pushing and driving correctly. All of you at one time or another have sprinted, and all of you at one time or another has sprinted uphill. And you all know that the uphill sprint gives you more of a sensation of push or drive, and that's kind of the feel that you want to experience in those first 6 steps. That's the drive phase, and that's what we're trying to feel at that particular point. Now, this can be overdone. You can overpush to the point where you're actually bounding out of the back and you're maintaining a forward lean far too deep into the run. And that, of course, would be the opposite mistake. But by far the most prevalent mistake is being too quick in those first few steps. Now, the second major consideration in the drive phase is our progression of our body angles and how to achieve good posture. If you remember when we showed the starting video, on the very first step of the start, you saw a marked forward lean by the jumper in the video. And we all know that as we progress down the runway, we want to come to an upright posture. Well, the way we do that is very important to understand. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to smoothly progress those body angles so that at the completion of the drive phase, we are now in an upright position. And more importantly, we see good alignment of the head and the hips. It's during the drive phase that we achieve the proper postures on the runway. We want our head to be neutral with respect to the spine, meaning that we're not going to tuck our chin or throw our head back at any time. The head is always in its natural basic alignment with the back. So the head is not an engine, it's a passenger. It just rides smoothly along and stays in position throughout the drive phase. The hips are more critical, even more critical, and might be the single most important aspect of approach running. We want the hips to achieve what we call a neutral position. We want the pelvis, the pelvic bones, to be aligned in a neutral position so that the pelvis is in alignment with the spine. By far, the most common mistake that we see in approach running is what we call an anterior pelvic tilt, which means basically that the hips are tilted forward. What we see in that situation is that the butt is kind of stuck out and we see a really marked curve in the lower back, a lordotic type of curve there. And that interferes greatly with the ability to sprint effectively, and it really messes with the ability to create the proper positions and angles at takeoff. So achieving a neutral position of the pelvis is absolutely important. And we're going to discuss here in a second exactly how to go about doing that. This is a video of a drill that I use with young jumpers called the wall drill. If you'll notice here, Jeremy is positioned near a wall and he'll fire into the wall. Now I'm pausing the video, so don't be confused. There is no long extended pause in the actual drill. But what if you'll notice that when Jeremy takes a step with his foot, you'll notice that as he pushes against the ground, his body angle is going to change. And every time he takes a step, the body angle changes significantly. So what he's doing is he's actually using the force of his steps to push himself up into a tall running position. So when you're executing the drive phase, this is what you want to feel. You should almost feel like you're climbing steps or climbing a ladder. And climb is a term that I actually use to describe the feeling that you experience in the drive phase. You see, the way that we get tall while we execute the drive phase is not by lifting your head and lifting your chest. It's by using the upward component of your steps, the vertical component of those steps, to push yourself up into a tall running position. And that push up is why we call it a climb. So again, the body angle changes come because of the fact that we push up with our legs, not because of the fact that we would lift the head and lift the chest. For example, right now, at this point, if you'll notice, Jeremy's hips are directed downward. If Jeremy right now would make a mistake and lift his head and lift his chest, then the head and the chest might be upright as indicated by my cursor, but the hips would still be directed downward. And that's the reason why many athletes demonstrate that anterior pelvic tilt or that butt out type of posture that we see in the approach run or even in sprinting. So that's important to understand. Lifting the head and the chest produces pelvic problems. It's important that they understand how to use the legs to get themselves up and not how to use the head and chest to get themselves up into a tall running position. Another good way to give this sensation to your athletes of the push or drive necessary in the drive phase is using resisted runs. Here you can see Richard dragging a sled. So dragging a sled or dragging a tire or possibly even uphill sprints, they're all good ways of teaching the sensation of drive or push that you want in the drive phase. Now let's discuss the continuation phase, the middle of the approach. Our first concern is conservation or preservation, meaning conservation and preservation of the good things we established at the end of the drive phase. The good postures, the neutral head alignment, and the neutral pelvic alignment that we produced at the end of the drive phase need to be maintained. The big ranges of motion, the big split of the thighs that we saw in the drive phase, that needs to be maintained as we develop frequency. Keep in mind that the range of motion or the split between the thighs is very important. Operating through big ranges of motion makes us inherently more efficient and it increases the length of our jumps. If you run with short choppy strides, you're going to have a short choppy jump. But if you run with big open strides, you're going to have a big open jump. There's a proportionality between the range of motion and the displacement that we actually achieve in the jump itself. So that openness being the term that we in our coaching system use for that split between the thighs and those ranges of motion, that openness is very important to establishing big performances and big jumps. Now, frequency needs to be developed patiently. So frequency should increase and each step on the runway should be a little quicker than the one before it, but that needs to be a patient process. And many athletes develop frequency too quickly and pay a price as a result of it. One of the most common mistakes in jumping at the high school level is typically simply trying to run too fast and producing frequencies too soon, too early, and prematurely. Unfortunately, this is a tape recorded presentation, but if you could kind of picture this, assume that you were standing in place and I got you to jog in place. So you're jogging in place slowly with nice high knees with real pretty mechanics. If I suddenly clap my hands and ask you to move your feet as fast as you possibly could, well, in order to move your feet real quickly, what you would do naturally is you would stick out your butt, bend at the waist, drop your knees, and shuffle your feet. Well, what you've done in that situation is because of the fact that I made you increase your frequency really fast, what you did is you gave up the pelvic alignment and you decreased the amplitudes of movement. And that's what a lot of young jumpers will do. So it's very important for them to understand that frequency development is helpful and is a good thing, but only if they're not compromising posture and only if they're not compromising the range of motion. Frequency needs to be developed within the context of a neutral pelvis and full range of motion at the hip joint. That split between the thighs needs to remain big. Now, another thing that's important in the continuation phase is the establishment of vertical pushing. We're trying to establish a vertical bounce. If you look at a good sprinter or a good jumper as they come down the track or the runway and you look at their hips, you see a very subtle bounce, a little bit of an up and down. They don't travel a level path, there's a subtle bounce to it. The high points of that bounce are when they're in the air between strides. The low points are when their foot hits the ground in the support phase of each stride. And that bounce is very important because that bounce is going to be amplified into the jump. Here you can see a picture of Jeremy, and I drew this red line behind it to kind of show that path. And again, this path might be a little extreme as far as the bounce is concerned, but I wanted you to be able to see. And the reason why this is important is because this bounce is going to be amplified into penultimate and takeoff. The preparation and takeoff are modifications of this path, as you see here. And if there isn't any bounce coming in, then it's impossible for them to effectively create that lift at takeoff. They'll have to stop on the penultimate or stick out the foot or make some kind of mistake there in the last few steps in order to produce lift because that bounce isn't present prior to that point. So this is something that's very important to understand. It's very similar to like when you get your car stuck in the mud, you rock it out, you push it forward, let it come back, push it forward, let it come back. And after you do that a few times, finally you give it a big push and it's out. Well, it's the same thing here. These subtle bounces on the runway amplify into a big bounce. And in the triple jump, you're basically amplifying into three bounces. So this is a key concept to understand. Now, it is a little hard to see um, with your coaching eye. So what I do is I typically look at shin angles. Here's a picture of the same jumper in the middle of the approach in the continuation phase, and notice that when the foot touches the ground, the shin is vertical. What that's telling us by the alignment of the shin is that we're pushing in a downward direction, which means we can rest assured that that bouncy environment is present. So as jumpers are coming down the runway, when I get to the middle of the run, I'm always looking at the angle of the shin when the foot hits the ground and making sure that that is indeed vertical in its alignment. That indicates the bounce is present. Stadium runs are a really good way to teach this vertical pushing. If you have your athletes touch every step, then the direction of push is vertical. And that's a good way to teach them how to push up and to establish this bouncy environment. Now let's discuss the transition phase, the final four steps. Our key theme here is conservation and preservation, maintaining the things that we've established prior to this point in the approach run. The posture should remain the same, still neutral head and neutral pelvis. The ranges of motion should remain big and open, that split between the thigh, and the amplitudes of movement should continue to be large. The vertical bounce should continue in those last few steps, and we should see a patient frequency increase in those last few steps as well. Now, several common problems erupt in the transition phase. A lot of times I get asked the question, well, coach, if the transition phase should look like the continuation phase, well, why do you separate it as a different phase? And the reason is because as a coach, you battle a lot of unique problems in these last four steps. I jokingly say all the time that the closer a jumper gets to the board, the dumber they get. And what I mean is that quite often, as a coach, you'll get them running properly on the runway, and then in those last few steps, they'll start doing things that are different. When if they had just kept doing the same thing that they were doing prior, they would have been perfectly fine. So these are some of the common problems that we battle in those last few steps. One is diminished amplitude. Sometimes jumpers drop the knees and decrease those ranges of motion and start shuffling in those last few steps. Those decreased ranges of motion result in shorter jumps. Frequency increases excessively. This is a very common mistake, probably one of the most common mistakes and one of the most commonly misunderstood things in coaching. Many good long jumpers have been wrecked because coaches tell them to accelerate through takeoff or to quicken up at takeoff. Actually, most of the work is done, and all you're trying to do at that point in time is gently maintain what you've developed up to that point. So the frequency increases should be extremely patient at this time, and excessively increasing frequency typically results in dropping the knees and poor postures and so forth. So again, This is not the time that you want your jumpers to quicken up. You want extremely patient frequency increase and not to overdo it at this point. Now, once in a while, you will get the odd jumper who might genuinely slow down in the transition phase, but that is typically few and far between. That's a very rare occurrence. By far, the most common mistake is trying to overwork those last few steps. If I have a jumper who, say, for example, is running 16 steps in their approach, what I'm always trying to drill into their head is that they're using 12 of those 16 steps to build up momentum and speed, and the last four steps, they're not really trying to accelerate, they're trying to simply position themselves to take off, and that enables us to avoid this particular problem. Sometimes in the last few steps, we don't have momentum, and that would go back to the way we ran the drive phase and problems and inefficiencies there. And then finally, in the last few steps, you have your accuracy concerns. You know, we need to be able to hit the board. And there are some unique processes that come into play here that we're going to discuss here in just a second. Now, let's take a look at a horizontal jump approach. Here we have a jump approach on video, and we're going to kind of look at some of the key landmarks that we should see in it as we progress. So here's Jeremy, again, running a long jump approach this time. And what we'll do now is we'll stop and we'll pause at some of the key points. So if you'll notice here, he uses a rollover start, and there you can see that hard forward lean on his first step. And then this is what we call, here you can see the big ranges of motion. And here you can see the climb. Every step he pushes up a little more until eventually at the end of the drive phase, he's upright. Now in the continuation phase, you can see an upright body posture now. The pelvis is neutral, and you can see that that split has been maintained. If you'll notice here also, as he contacts the track, you can see that the shin angles are pretty much vertical as well, which is indicative of the vertical pushing. So when I'm personally coaching, anytime that I am looking at an approach run, those are typically the things that I'm looking for. Those are the graphics that you saw superimposed over Jeremy as he ran. Those are the markers that I'm looking for, and I want to make sure that they're present on every approach run. Now, let's talk a little bit about visual focus in the approach. Where should your eyes be? Long jumpers undergo a process called steering. Steering refers to the ability to kind of adjust stride lengths in some way, shape, or form in order to hit the board. And the process of target tracking is involved in that, the ability to locate the board and adjust those stride lengths and track it effectively. Now, all long jumpers do this, and it's important that we understand this. Now, this does not mean that practicing the approach for consistency is not important, because we want those adjustments to be very small, not big ones. But at the same time, we have to understand that there will be some subtle adjustment that is taking place on every single jump. Even the very best long jumpers and the most consistent long jumpers normally make small errors that total up to about 1 foot in length from jump to jump. And the jumper that you see who hits the board perfectly every single time is not necessarily the most consistent jumper. It's typically the jumper who is the best at performing this steering and is the best at performing this target tracking process. So the key to teaching and allowing this to happen effectively is visual focus. So here's what we want our athletes to do with their eyes as they're running the approach. In the drive phase, you want them looking at the board. Now, for the first couple of steps, you might be leaning forward a little bit too much to see it. But if that's the case, it's not a problem. As soon as you're up early, up enough to see it, you should be looking right at it. In the continuation phase, your head stays up, but through the bottom part of your peripheral vision, you're still continuing to look at the board. And then in the transition phase, by this time, you've been tracking the board all along. You have a feeling for how fast you're moving. You have a feeling for where the board is. Because of the fact that you've been tracking it all along, you can lose visual contact with the board and still put your foot on it very easily. So the key here is to look at the board for the first part of the approach so that you don't have to drop your head and look at it in the last few steps of the approach. Many times when athletes peek at the board or drop their head in the last few steps to see the board, it's because they haven't looked at it earlier in the approach. And as far as the old wives' tale about never look at the board when you're running the approach, that's not even true, and that's incorrect. We know for a fact that this isn't the case. So teach your jumpers to look at the board early in the approach so that they have an idea of where it is. You'll try this at home sometimes. If you pick an object across the room, if you're looking at that object as you walk toward it, you'll find that you can close your eyes at the last instant and still pick it up because your mind has taken a picture of where it is and your body has tracked it all along. Even though you're not looking at it at the last instant, you can still pick it up with your hands because you were tracking it as you approach it. This is the same type of process that we're trying to employ here as far as locating the board. So again, look at the board early so that you don't have to drop the head and look at it late. Now, when we develop the approach, these are the things that we need to do. We have to teach the start. We have to teach acceleration mechanics. We have to teach the continuation mechanics, the upright pushing that we saw in the middle of the approach. Then we have to assemble the approach and then transfer it to the runway and then finally add the takeoff. So this is how we would assemble an approach. Now let's look at the process of assembling an approach for a beginning jumper. You begin by teaching the acceleration and the continuation mechanics, spending maybe a day or so getting them in the ballpark mechanically on what you want there. So these would be technical runs. Notice that they're done on the track, away from the distraction of the board and the sand and the pit. Then lay down the tape measure and have them run from 0. Now you as a coach now become a stride counter. What you want to do is you know how many strides your jumper is going to run. You want to mark the last step of the approach, and you want to mark the fourth to last step of the approach. Now Jeremy here runs 19 steps. He's a good athlete. He runs 19 steps. And so we're going to mark the location of the 19th step and the location of the fourth to last step, which would be the 15th step. The reason why is that the 15th step is going to give us the location of an important check mark that we're going to use a little bit later. So notice here that he's going to come down the runway running beside the tape measure, and I as a coach am going to step onto the track and I put that cone there and I mark the location of that 15th step. Here he's coming down and I'm going to mark the location of the 19th step. So now I've marked that location, and we're going to do this 2 or 3 times to make sure that we're consistent. And once we develop a certain level of consistency hitting those 2 marks, then we're going to transfer this over to the runway. So over to the runway we go, and both cones are placed. Obviously, the end of the approach is placed at the board, and the fourth to last step is being placed 4 steps away at that particular distance. Now, if Jeremy was a younger jumper and was only running like a 16-step approach, then maybe I would mark the 16th step and the 12th step. If he was a middle schooler or a developmental person, say only running 14 steps, well then I would mark the 10th step and the 14th step. So we're always marking the last step, and we're also marking the fourth to last step. Now, he's going to run this approach, and I never let them take off on the first few because you never know if they have to reach or chopper a little bit. They might, ding an ankle or something like that if they are off a little. So I typically let them just run through without actually taking off for the first few trials. Now notice as Jeremy runs down the runway, when he gets 4 steps away from the takeoff, you're going to see a cone appear over here on the runway, which will be the location of that fourth to last step. And you'll notice that his right foot is going to hit that cone as he comes down. And there you see the cone come into vision, and he hit it pretty closely. And then after you're confident that there's some accuracy present, then you can start to add the takeoff. Now let's discuss approach management. Approach management refers to the process that we as coaches use as far as observing and adjusting the things that we do in order to keep our athletes on the board, the things that we do to preserve accuracy. We know that accuracy in the long jump and the triple jump is very important, and we also know that fouls can drive you crazy at certain points in a competition as well. So how we can keep our athletes on the board and yet prevent them from fouling, that's what approach management is all about. And the first step there is to understand the relationship between stride length and stride frequency. Anytime one goes up, the other tends to go down. There's an inverse relationship between those two. What that means is if the stride frequency increases and we get quicker, the strides will get shorter. If the stride frequency decreases, then the strides will get longer. So, for example, if your jumper is hitting the board consistently and suddenly they find themselves behind the board, or suddenly they find they're having to reach to get to the board, our thought process should not be to move the check mark. Our thought process should be, well, they're reaching now, so the strides must have gotten shorter. If the strides have gotten shorter, that must mean that the frequency of the run has increased. So we would talk to that jumper about being more patient in their frequency development, and that would be the fix for that particular situation. So understanding that relationship between stride length and stride frequency is key in approach management. Um, The most common mistake by far in long jumping and triple jumping, as far as approach running, is simply trying to run too fast. And often athletes will try harder. You know, whenever you go to a meet and the athlete that you've trained and hits the board consistently in practice is nowhere near the board, you can pretty much rest assured that the problem is that they're simply trying to run too fast. Their frequencies are developing far too quickly, and as a result, they're experiencing severe inaccuracy in their approach. So again, the idea of patient frequency development is a key here, and that typically tends to break down in competitive situations. And the most common area where it does break down is in the drive phase. So good jump coaches are always reminding their athletes, continually reminding them that the drive phase should be strong and patient, strong and slow. And it's not uncommon at all, you know, in a competition for an athlete who needs a big jump to get on the runway, run their drive phase far too fast because of the excitement, and find themselves reaching as a result of running the drive phase too fast. That's why, again, in good jump coaches in critical situations are typically reminding athletes to be patient, slow but strong in their drive phases. Now, we also know that we need momentum. Many mistakes, a lot of the fouls and a lot of the deceleration at takeoff that we see sometimes in jumping events results because of the fact that they didn't develop momentum early. Quite often we see athletes in the long jump who lower too much, or athletes in the long jump who stick out their foot on the board and do things like this. And the reason why they do these things is because when they get to the board, they feel like something is missing. And the thing that is missing is momentum. They didn't drive out of the back properly. And because of that, they're sensing momentum deprivation. They're sensing a missing momentum at takeoff, and they compromise for it by making these mistakes. So quite often, a lot of the mistakes we see at takeoff are related to improper execution of the drive phase. The failure to drive out and push and develop momentum early results in these later mistakes. Now, it's a good idea to have a checkmark plan. We need to keep in mind that our jumpers steer. As we said earlier, jumpers are always making subtle adjustments in those final few steps in order to get on the board. And the philosophy that I always tell my jumpers is that your approach does not put you on the board. Your approach puts you close to the board. You put yourself on the board by this steering process. So that being said, if our jumpers run down in warm-ups and touch the board, it doesn't tell us anything because they might be reaching or chopping to get to the board because of this steering process. So this is where that coaching check mark comes in. If you remember when we were setting up our approach, we marked the location of the fourth to last step, and that would be the location of the coaching check mark. The jumper's check mark, of course, is the beginning of the run. So this would be the piece of tape where they start their run. This is the piece of tape that they put down where their fourth to last step should hit. And the reason why, this is the beginning of the transition phase, and this is where they start to make those adjustments. Hopefully those adjustments will be very tiny, but those adjustments, again, are always present. So that being said, this is a coaching check mark. The jumper is ignoring this mark, but you as a coach are paying attention to it because it's going to give you important information about the length of those last few steps. So let's look at some examples. Right here, this situation. Here, our jumper is on the board fairly well. But here, the jumper is over the coaching check mark. So, what's happening here, if the jumper is over the coaching check mark and on the board, these last few steps are shortening excessively. They're shorter than they should be. So, this jumper is effectively slowing down. So this is a jumper who needs to back up. They need to back up the jumper's check mark here so they can get on the coaching check mark and preserve the proper spacing in these last few steps. You see, if you did not have the coaching check mark, you might think that that jumper was perfect because of the fact that they hit the board okay. But that jumper's not okay. They're chopping badly in those last few steps. Here's another example. In this situation, the athlete hits the board perfectly, but the athlete is behind the coaching check mark. So this athlete is obviously reaching badly in these last few steps. Because of this, again, if you were only concerned with the board, you might think that the athlete was fine, but that isn't the case at all. They're reaching badly in those last few steps. In fact, some athletes, when they reach really badly, they lose the ability to place their feet correctly, and as a result, they'll end up fouling even though they're reaching. So in this situation, this athlete needs to be closer to the board. Now, I might not move the jumper's check mark forward. I might tell them to push out of the back harder, for example, possibly. But something needs to be done so that this athlete can cover less distance in those final few steps here. And again, if in this situation the athlete fouls and is behind the check mark, that's a extremely challenging thing for a coach because you have to tell an athlete to move up when they actually did foul. That would be the correct coaching move, and obviously the athlete might not understand that. So that's something that you typically have to convince them of in certain situations, and it's a very challenging thing coaching wise for them to understand. Other aspects of approach management. Your posture has a lot to do with your ability to steer. If you come into the board and your pelvis is tilted forward, you have, if you're one of those people who has anterior pelvic tilt with the butt out posture, you're experiencing instability. Every step for you is not a good, clean step. Every step for you has a little bit of a forward fall to it. There's a little bit of instability. You're always forward. If you were out jogging in the morning and you tripped over a curb accidentally, and you were about to stumble, you would take a long step in order to catch yourself and regain your balance. Well, this is kind of what's happening with these athletes is as they come to the board, because they have this bad posture, they feel a little off balance and a little forward, and they'll typically lengthen their last step in order to regain balance. And when they lengthen their last step, they end up fouling. So in this situation, you might have the athlete foul by an inch and you back them up and they foul by an inch again and you back them up and they foul by an inch once again. And it doesn't matter how far back you get them, they continue to foul by an inch. And that's because the foul is not caused because the location of the check mark is a problem. The foul is caused because of the posture being the problem. They foul by the same amount all the time. The foul is consistent because the posture is consistently incorrect. The posture is always the same degree of incorrectness, therefore the foul is always the same. So in short, one piece of advice is when your athletes are fouling, always look to improve technique before you do anything with the check mark. We as coaches tend to move the check mark far too much. And we're far too reactive with it. If a jumper has technical mistakes, you cannot rely upon the check mark to do your coaching for you. It's very important to make those corrections in those situations. And there are other reasons why athletes foul sometimes. Sometimes when athletes decelerate on the penultimate step, that disrupts their sense of flow and their sense of tracking. And often athletes who sit on the penultimate step or decelerate on the penultimate step will foul. The answer in those situations is not to move the check mark, but to eliminate the deceleration or the slowdown on the penultimate step. Sometimes athletes have bad tracking, and this is quite often the case when athletes are had bad postures and so forth. Sometimes you'll find athletes that just always foul by a half an inch or something like that. One time I had a young lady who always fouled by half an inch. So one time I actually had her close her eyes and put her foot on the board with her eyes closed, and she still fouled, stationary, just standing there by half an inch. And what we started to do in that situation was to have her actually try to place her foot in the middle of the board. So this is a good piece of advice for you. If you have an athlete who is making mistakes and has technical problems and they're fouling, fix the technical problems. But if you have athletes who are jumping well and fouling, then simply have them pick a different target. Have them put their toe in the middle of the board instead of taking all of the board until they kind of get used to it. In most situations, when the athlete is jumping well and is technically sound and they're fouling, it'll typically go away by itself. It seems that when athletes start running well and when athletes start doing things correctly and we get those improvements, their depth perception changes a little bit and it takes a little bit of time before they kind of tune in and adjust. I have never had an athlete ever who ever jumped really far who didn't foul some long ones before they actually got them. So if you have an athlete who's jumping fouling really far, then the answer is just to be patient and just keep getting them to the meets and keep getting them in competitions, and the chances are that stuff will disappear in time. But if they're fouling because of technical mistakes, then you have to jump in there and you have to make those corrections. Now, when wind is a factor, what I do is I put down an alternate check mark. If it's a face wind, I'll normally put another check mark in front of their standard check mark. If the wind is a tailwind, I'll have another mark behind their check mark. And what I'll have them do is get on the runway and feel. If they feel no wind, they stay where they are. If they do feel the wind, then they move to the other check mark. It's not perfect, but it's a good way to manage wind. And a key thing to understand in windy conditions is that athletes need to keep their focus. This happens quite often. An athlete will get a headwind and won't jump very far because of the headwind. On the second jump, they get another headwind. But on the third jump, finally there is no wind, but the athlete hits a bad jump because of the fact that they've lost focus, because of the fact that they got slammed by the wind the first two times. They're in a bad mindset when they approach the third jump. So it's important to understand that that's why you get three in case something bad happens, or to even things out over time. So it's important that in windy conditions that you keep focus, because any jump might be the one where you might get the good wind as opposed to the bad wind. That's very important to understand. And my last comment about fouling is, remember that you in your practice environment need to establish a culture regarding the fact that fouls are not acceptable. Don't allow your athletes to foul in practice. I've been to long jump workouts with other coaches, and I see that the athletes begin the day jumping from the board, but by the end of the day, they're jumping from the end of the runway, and nobody's really paying any attention to the board. Don't allow that to happen. Make sure that athletes don't foul in practice. Make sure that you do the things that help to train the steering processes and so forth. Make sure that they own their fouls. It's important that they understand that fouls don't happen by accident, that fouls happen for reasons, and most of the time fouling is your fault. So it's important that athletes are taught to own their fouls. It's important that athletes also understand that big fouls don't necessarily take care of themselves in the short term. So many times I see an athlete who'll hit a big foul who'll come out of the pit smiling. It's not an occasion to be smiling. It's an occasion to understand that it is a zero. It is a foul. It goes down as an X on the card and it doesn't count. All right. So you have to have a sense of urgency about placing yourself on the board. And that's another reason why athletes foul quite often, is simply there is no sense of urgency about not fouling. So again, making them own their fouls, making them understand that there is no foul God who curses people, and making them understand the culture associated with fouling and the mentality associated with fouling that they need to be successful is a critical part of dealing with this particular problem. Thank you very much for your attention and for listening. This is my personal email address, so if you'd like to get in touch with me at any time, you're more than welcome to do so.